Here's a quick guide to mounting a new scope to a hunting rifle. A mate loaned us his rifle to do some testing, but he wanted to upgrade his scope, so the least we could do was do the work for him. The first thing to do is just remove the old scope. We don't need to reuse the rings, because the Vector Optic scope that we're putting on it comes with its own rings, so what we're going to do is just leave the bases in place and start from there. What we will check first is that all the base screws are done up firmly. If they're loose, we'll have all sorts of problems trying to get a consistent grip out of the rifle. And yep, they're all fine, no problems. So what we'll do is we'll fit up the Vector scope, a good one for this sort of rifle, 2 to 12 for a 243. Good range of magnification, I reckon, especially for a hunting rifle. The Continental's got excellent optics, German glass in it, so it'll go nicely with this. Now, I said they've got their own rings. They are a hell of a lot more solid than the ones we had. These aren't going to go anywhere. We've got 4 screws on top for extra clamping and a good solid clamping screw at the base. There's a couple of tricks to doing these up and getting them right. I'll show you those as we go. First thing we're going to do is turn the rifle around so that we're actually working on this side of the receiver, away from the bolt. That way there's no risk of anything getting in the way when you're working the action. You'll always find dust and dirt once you take the rings off. Bases attract dirt that you can't easily clean off. This rifle's been sitting in a bag and it's been out in the bush in dusty conditions, so it's very dirty. I hate working on dirty things, and I'm going to give it a good lube afterwards because it's all a little bit dry. Now, the way these mounting systems work, you've got the base attached to the receiver and the base has a groove in it. The bolt that clamps the rings on sits in the groove, and that's what locks everything in place, as well as the clamps on the side. So when we mount the ring, we loosen off the bolt, slot it over into the groove and tighten it up. But we don't just tighten it up any old how, because these are not an interference fit. There's movement fore and aft as well as sideways. 2 things about that: it should self-center itself once you tighten the bolt up and when the scope's in place. Afterwards, I'll show you a little trick for making sure it does center. But the other thing is, when a rifle recoils, it moves backwards. The scope is a mass that doesn't necessarily want to move with it unless it's forced to. So if you mount the ring back there, when the rifle recoils, it'll go back and the ring will move forward. Your scope will move, and that, of course, is no good for accuracy. So what we want to do is push the ring all the way forward and then tighten up the clamping force. Now, just do it finger tight and then use the tool that's supplied to torque this up. If you over tighten these, they will snap, and then you can't fit your rings at all. You'll need a new bolt for it. It's a real problem, and I've seen it happen a lot. The trick is to use the tool to just gently nip it up. Torque it down until it just starts to grip. Don't go any further than that. That's a firm grip. And that length there on the arm is designed to allow you to torque it correctly. That's all it needs. Any more than that, you just risk breaking the bolt. Any less, it will come loose. So of course, make sure it is reasonably well torqued up. So it's the front ring now. We loosen off the clamp, drop the ring over, make sure it's all the way forward against the groove, and then tighten it up finger tight for now. Grab our tool, use the long arm so that we can correctly torque it, pull it down until it just starts to grip firmly, and that is fine. That's all we need to do. Next trick, let's take the tops off the rings so that we can put the scope in place. And in this case, we're lucky that the scope actually fits. Because these 2 individual bases are not a rail with lots of mounting points, they've only got 1 mounting point each, the rings end up a fixed distance apart that we can't control. Fortunately, the length of the scope tube is spot on, a perfect fit. So once we've got it sitting there, the first thing to do is to put the tops on the rings. We want to get them on because if we don't, you risk dropping the scope on the ground when you pick up the rifle. Seen that happen too, and it's not good for the scope. Now we tighten in a crossover pattern. Tighten the bolts down just very gently, a little bit at a time, so you're bringing the scope base down evenly on both sides. We don't want to clamp it down tight, just leave it loose at this stage. And I'll show you another trick once we've got the other one on. What we'd normally do at this stage is test eye relief, which is how far the end of the scope is from your eye. It's got to be a fixed distance from your eye, depending upon the scope and its design, and it'll give you the full sight picture. These mounts don't give us the ability to move the scope, so we're stuck. That's a compromise. I'd put a rail on this rifle, which would give me the ability to put the mounts closer together, and then the ability to move the scope fore and aft if we need to. As it is, the owner's got these mounts, he's stuck with it, he's going to have to live with it. Now we can still rotate the scope. What we need to do is get it sitting perfectly level in line with the rifle, so the crosshairs are in line with the bore. There are more scientific ways to put on a scope and align it, but for a hunting rifle, you'll get good enough results just by eyeballing it. Looks pretty good to me. So we've got the 4 bolts here. We're going to clamp them down tight now. We'll screw them down in a cross pattern, as we said. We'll take each one down just a little bit at a time until it bottoms, no further. That way we can bring the top of the ring down evenly on both sides for even clamping force. If you tighten down one side too much, you'll close the gap and have a big gap on the other side. Now we don't want that, so we're going to open this back up and do it properly. So again, just using the cross pattern, down a little bit at a time from side to side. And we're only just nipping each one up just a bit tighter each time. Now forgive the lack of continuity here while I show you how to correctly torque down the ring screws. I had to change rifles after ruining the original footage. So to torque them down, continuing the crossover pattern we mentioned earlier, use the key vertically until you can't comfortably squeeze it any tighter. Turn the key 90 degrees, then use the long arm and your fingers to apply the correct torque. You do not need a torque wrench to do this. Just insert the key into the screw and use your fingers on the long arm to pull it round until it's comfortably tight. Continue to do the same thing on that crossover pattern that we talked about until you've torqued them all up, just using your fingers on the long arm of the key, nice and firm until they don't go any further. Any looser and you'll find the scope will move under recoil, and that's no good. Any tighter and you risk crushing the tube, which of course will ruin the scope. So just remember, that length there with your fingers on it will give you the correct torque for the rings. To make sure the rings are properly aligned and sitting correctly and not twisted one way or the other, what we'll do is briefly loosen both of them off and check that everything's as far forward as it will go, and the scope tube will have the self-centering effect on the rings to make sure they're properly aligned, not twisted or misaligned. Again, what we do is just gently torque them up using the tool and no more, so that we don't strip the bolts. And there you go, one beautifully mounted scope. All that leaves is to sight it in, but that is a story for another video.